Ciao friends, welcome to another video from SQL BI. In this video, we're talking all about tools in Power BI. When you're creating semantic models and reports, you could do everything you need in Power BI Desktop, but you're going to run into a lot of different challenges that are quite difficult to solve. There are, thankfully, a lot of tools that help tackle these challenges specifically, or that generally just try to help you be more efficient and productive when you're creating models and reports so that you can save time and headache. It's important to know what these tools are, when and how you might use them, so that you can get benefits from them to more easily solve these challenges when you run into them. That's what this video and article is all about, to give you an overview of some of the more common tools so that you can investigate farther about when and how you can apply them to your workflow. We're not going to go into a lot of detail or talk about every single tool that exists, just giving some common examples and pointing you in the right direction of where you can go to learn more. In the article, we give a little bit more details and links and resources for you to find more information, so be sure to check the link to the article in the description of this video below. Let's take a look at some of the tools that you can use in Power BI and how they can help you save time and just make better models and reports. Let's take a look. In Power BI, there's a lot of different tools that you can use for a lot of different reasons. The way that I like to think about this is with respect to the life cycle of your models and reports, or basically the high-level steps that you take in order to make a model and a report, all the way from start to finish. So let's walk through that process very briefly, and then we're going to take a look at how some of these tools cater to a specific part of this, while others help you or support you more broadly throughout development. So the first step that you typically take is when you design or gather requirements for a model and a report. You're basically trying to figure out what are we going to make and how are we going to make it. This is when you're engaging with business users and digging through the data and trying to understand, okay, how are we going to proceed? What are we actually going to do here? Once you have an idea, a clear idea of what you're going to make, then you start with the implementation or building the actual model and reports. Of course, in a semantic model, this is going to come down to connecting to the data, adding tables, creating relationships, adding measures, this kind of stuff. And with reports, it's all about creating and formatting those visuals. Once you do the implementation, you're going to, of course, eventually need to test or validate what you've made. You want to make sure that the visuals are appearing and working how you expect, including the interactions, that the numbers or the actual data from the model and the calculations are also returning the expected results, and that everything is performant from the experience of the users. Then you're going to need to, of course, deploy or publish these models and reports into the Power BI service or Fabric, so to a workspace, because that's where you're going to be sharing things, that's where you're going to be collaborating, and there's a lot of features that you can only use in the Power BI service. Now, building, testing, and deploying, this isn't something that you just do step by step. It's typically something that you do in a more iterative process. You're continuously building and then doing a bit of testing. You're going to publish to the service. This is a process that you're going to be repeating over and over throughout your development cycles. At a certain point, though, you're going to want to manage whatever it is that you're making. For example, you might want to be able to make changes to it over time in response to changes to the business, requests, or even issues and problems. And this is to be expected. Of course, the business is never staying the same, so your models and reports shouldn't either. But you're also going to need to optimize your models and reports. Optimization might be something that you do as a result of testing, but it might also need to be something that you do over time as your models and reports get bigger and more complex. Optimization could refer to making sure that whatever your models and reports are going to return results in a really fast way. So visuals are going to render really quickly, and your DAX measures are going to evaluate in a very quick way as well. So your model is going to be very performant, and your DAX is going to be as efficient as possible. Then, once people are actually using the model, using the report, you're going to need to monitor it. And that's going to come down to making sure that, of course, people are using it. So looking at things like usage, as well as things related to governance and administration, following up with these kind of things so you can make sure that you're kind of got a hold of what's happening inside of your tenant, inside of your workspaces, and eventually make decisions like having trainings or doing additional adoption, or even eventually retiring and decommissioning models and reports, because no one's going to use this stuff forever. So different tools in the Power BI ecosystem will cater to different parts of this process, because most tools are quite specialized. There are some exceptions. For example, Tabular Editor and a lot of the LLM tools that are available now cater more widely to a number of the parts of this process. For Tabular Editor with semantic models, and of course with large language models, this is going to be for both models and reports, depending on what you're doing. But in general, for example, there are going to be tools that support you mainly during the design phase, other tools that support you mainly during the build phase, and others that support you as you test, deploy, manage, optimize, and so on and so forth. You'll notice that there's a lot of tools in particular that help you with the management of models and reports, as well as the optimization. And that's because you're going to run into a lot of quite specific challenges at that point where you might need more specialized tools. For example, how DAX Studio can help you really dive into the specifics of the server timings of DAX queries to basically see where the performance bottlenecks are so you can actually do the optimization. Now, what's important to say is we're not going to walk through every single one of these tools. After this, I'm just going to give a few examples here and there. So I want to state again that if you do want a more complete overview in the article, we do go step by step through each of these tools. But again, there's a lot of tools in Power BI and there's new tools coming out all the time. So even that list is not fully complete. It's just important to understand as you're working through your development of your models, of your reports, as you're running into challenges, that you're able to identify the use cases and scenarios when a particular tool might be meaningful and beneficial for you, in that it could save you time and help you solve a problem. Now, to illustrate this, you might be going through a particular development of a report or a model. You're making this model or report in Power BI Desktop, and maybe you start off with a design phase. You need to create some wireframes and some mockups based on the requirements so that business users can better understand what you're talking about. For that, you might want to leverage tools like Excalidraw, which is what we're using right now, and Figma in order to create something more sophisticated. Once you've created those mockups and wireframes, you then maybe want to create something like your report theme JSON, where you could leverage tools like Power BI Designer or Power Designer, as well as large language models to help you generate specific aspects of that theme, or to generate background images, for example, that you could use in your reports. From there, you maybe continue and start to create the model in Power BI Desktop, you add some tables and so on, and at this point, you might want to reuse certain things, like using Bravo to create a date table, using Timdal scripts in the Timdal view to create static templates that you reuse from other models, things like a last refresh table, and maybe using Tabular Editor with C# scripts or even notebooks from Fabric in order to create dynamic templates, things like DAX patterns such as currency conversion or Pareto, the kind of stuff that's more complicated and that might revolve more references to other objects inside of your model. When you're done creating the basics of your model, you might start to work on the report. And from there, once you are building out the report, you might already notice some performance issues, that some of the visuals are returning their results very slowly. You might then rely on the Performance Analyzer pane in Power BI Desktop to get some information about where that is an issue with the rendering of the visual, or whether it's something with the DAX query. You can copy that query out into DAX Studio, and then you can leverage tools like DAX Optimizer to really identify where those bottlenecks are, to drill down a little bit deeper and solve the problem, so you can proceed with your development and your report or model lifecycle. Now, this is a very high-level simplified example, but the illustrated point here is just that you're not, using tools just because. You're very often using them in response to or reaction to some kind of issue or challenge that you're running into. you're having a performance bottleneck, so you're turning to things like the Performance Analyzer pane in DAX Studio and DAX Optimizer. You need to create a theme file that's painful and awful to do without any support, so you're using Power Designer, you're using LLM tools, this kind of thing. Basically, these tools exist to support you in specific tasks and challenges that you're running into as you're doing your development. Like I said, there's going to be other tools that support you more generally, but still, often those tools are intended to support you when you need some kind of performance benefit or you're trying to really get the absolute most from your model. For example, when your models are very sophisticated and complex, or when your skills as a Power BI developer, as a semantic model developer, are going to reach a certain level that you really want to streamline and optimize everything in your workflow. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some examples of some of these tools, giving you an idea of when and how you might use them. For example, we're going to talk about Excalidraw, which is actually the tool that we're looking at right now, a useful tool for design and the requirements gathering of models and reports. We're going to talk about Tabular Editor, since it's something that is involved in potentially all of the steps of model development, with the exception of monitoring. And we're going to talk about Tabular Editor 3, since it has the most features and can give you the most value. We're going to talk about DAX Studio, since it's something that is essential for you to be able to optimize your model and your DAX to identify bottlenecks. But we'll also talk about a few features that are baked into Fabric and Power BI, like the DAX Query View, the Tyndall View, and Fabric Notebooks. Specifically, we'll talk about Semantic Link and Semantic Link Labs. Now again, if we tried to tell you everything about even the tools that I mentioned here, this would take hours. So we're only really going to give a few very simple examples of what these tools can do, just so you get a bit of an idea and you kind of understand what this looks like. But mostly it's to encourage you to investigate this for yourself so you could see how these tools could fit into your workflow and where it can benefit you when it comes to helping you solve problems or be more efficient. So that's it. All right, so let's start with Excalidraw. Like I said, Excalidraw is the tool we're using right now. It's basically a digital whiteboard. It's free to use, and you can just start by creating illustrations, much like you would on a whiteboard or paper. The only difference is that you have these tools that are going to make that a bit easier. It will persist after you close and reopen the browser, but to get it to persist across devices or to have like a library, you need to have a paid subscription. Now, for semantic models, why would you use this? Well, you could represent concepts, so related to the business process that you're modeling, but also your model itself. So during the requirements gathering phase, it's very good to kind of do a rough illustration of what tables you need, what relationships are going to be there, the basic parts and pieces. Get a bit of a visual representation of that initial model concept before you're going to be creating something more sophisticated that shows the schema or all the columns and the data types, stuff like that. So Excalidraw can be very useful for this, but of course it's also useful for reports because you can make mockups or wireframes of single visuals or entire reports using Excalidraw. And this is definitely something that I recommend because it helps users get an idea of what you're going to be making and what they should expect or understand when you're talking about different chart types and how their data could be represented visually. It's also very beneficial for you to do this because it helps you think through the data, think through the design, and to put together a bit of like a visual representation of what you're actually going to make. So this is an example of 4 different visualization types that you could use for parts to whole data. And it's very quick and easy to do. Creating these was something that just took me a few minutes. So once you get comfortable working in Excalidraw, particularly with all those keyboard shortcuts, you can do a lot very quickly. Very easy, very straightforward tool for sketching and wireframing. Very beneficial, not just for the design, but also for documentation. So definitely worth keeping in mind. So maybe you're going to next proceed with creating a theme, or you're going to create some assets. You're going to use some other tools for this. But a lot of people then might continue in Power BI Desktop. And you can do everything that you need to in Power BI Desktop, like I said, creating the model, creating the report, all that stuff. But there are a lot of tools that can help you either speed up this process or address specific challenges. Now, to give an example, I'm going to talk about Tabular Editor because it is likely the largest tool with respect to all the different features and tools that it has available to help you. and since it's involved the most in all the different steps of semantic model development. So I'll talk about Tabular Editor 3, since it's the most feature-rich. There's also Tabular Editor 2, which is free to use, but it has less features than Tabular Editor 3. If you want more information, you can go to tabulareditor.com. So let's say you're looking at the turnover. This could be a model that someone else made and that you took over, but it could also be something that you're starting to make yourself. Very simple measure that just has the business logic, basically adding different fields together to create our gross sales. Now, if you wanted to understand what these measures are, you would normally have to type them in this data pane here, so total net invoice value, and you'd have to click through everything, and then go back, close this, go back to your original measure. And this, in the long run, it costs you a lot of time. So one of the core foundations of Tabular Editor is it has a lot of little features that save you tremendous amounts of time, quality of life features. For example, instead of doing that, you can just right-click and peek the definition for any referenced measure or column or whatever it is. So we can immediately see what the definition is for this measure that we've referenced. And if we want to make a change, we can go to definition, and Tabular Editor will also make suggestions for us. So based off of best practices for DAX and things like this, it's going to give us this light bulb, and it's going to suggest use divide instead of division, and it will tell you why. So if you click on that, it will make the change for you. It can also format your DAX with a keyboard shortcut or by pushing this button. And then when we are ready to go back, we can go back to our original measure and keep working. So these are just a few very simple, very basic examples of things you can do when you're writing DAX, but it also amounts to stuff like the user interface. The fact that you can see the properties at the same time as you see the DAX and get all this code assistance. You can customize these layouts by dragging and dropping the windows to make them larger or smaller, popping them out to put them on other monitors or rearrange them. And you can save these layouts to reuse them. Like I have a separate layout for auditing and optimizing models as I do for development. And Tabular Editor has a lot of different windows that do a lot of different things, including windows like this to help you develop, but also windows more related to the optimization of your model, like the Vertipack Analyzer. So basically you have everything at your fingertips that you need to develop a model. So it helps you really focus on one model, scale within that model, so you can do whatever it is that you need to do, be it optimization, writing DAX, working in Power Query. And once you really start to get comfortable doing that, you can even automate a lot of things and create dynamic templates and even leverage AI using scripts and macros. Now, to give you an example, I have a number of macros that do a lot of things. I have a macro here that is going to count everything in the model and give me a quick overview so that when I'm auditing a model, I can quickly see what are the contents. I have macros for templates, and I just have 3 simple templates that I have here, but I have a huge library of templates that I can reuse that save me a ton of time. So the simplest example I can give you is, for example, a date table, and it's going to be a dynamic template. So it's not just a static date table that's copy and pasted between models, but it's even going to prompt me for the earliest date, which in this date is the order date, the latest date, the ship date, and it's going to automatically create a date table based off of those fields from the earliest to the latest date, and it's going to add it in the model, which we have here, and it's going to automatically organize this into display folders and properties and things like this. But the best part about that is that it's all dynamic. So it's depending on what I select at the time in which I run that script. And that's something that makes these scripts very unique, is that it can do that. So, of course, one thing that I like also about Tabular Editor is the fact that you can always undo any change you make. So be it a script, I can just press Ctrl-Z and it's gone. But even if I am to, for example, delete all the measures from my model, so I can just press Ctrl-Z and they're back. So any change I make, I can always undo, be it from a script or manual. Now, these scripts can also be very, very sophisticated, doing things like formatting everything in your model from Power Query to DAX, or even leveraging AI. So I have some very simple examples of, for instance, if I go down here to some, let's say, I'll go to the brands, or I'll go down to the customers, and then I'll select measures, managers, selecting a few measures and columns at the same time. And then I can use AI to make suggestions for descriptions, format strings, display folders, but I can even have other scripts and macros that can suggest new measures for my model or changes to my DAX. So I can use these scripts to do a lot of very sophisticated things like that. So for example, if I run this script, I'm going to be able to even modify the prompt. So I can have a custom prompt, and just to give a very funny and silly example, make the description sound like a pirate. And I'll copy that into both the measure and the column prompt. So I'm doing both of these things at the same time. I can give custom instructions for measures and columns. And all of this is just something custom that I made just using these C# scripts. So it's now going to process this, starting with the measures. And after a couple seconds, it's going to give me a suggestion of a description that I can use. And as we can see, I told it to sound like a pirate. So it's giving us a rather silly description that isn't going to be particularly useful, but is going to make us laugh. So I'm going to cancel that, and we'll proceed. But these C# scripts and macros, even if you don't know anything about C# at all, you can create them very, very easily using AI now. With models like Cloud especially are very good at this. So the example I just gave was something that I created in not too long, like I think 10 minutes or so of just working with Claude. I am not a C# expert. I never learned C#. I just wanted to use the model to help make my life easier. And it's really amazing what you can do. So in the future, we'll create some more videos and give some more examples of this. But really, there's no limit to what's possible, especially when you start leveraging APIs like APIs from AI. So of course, it just is going to depend on what your use case is and how you can get the benefit from there. So this is Tabular Editor, a tool that can help you throughout semantic model development with simple things like writing DAX, but even more sophisticated stuff, especially if you're going to be leveraging these C# scripts, which you can write with the help of AI. So as you are continuing in order to create your model, at a certain point, you might need to optimize it. Now, one of the ways that you can optimize your model is when you're creating your report, you might notice that as you're filtering through, for example, the different months, you might see that some of the visuals, like this visual here, are taking longer to render than others. So we can see here that this bar chart, this Pareto bar chart, that it's slower than the other visuals that we have in this report. So what we could do is we could open this Performance Analyzer pane here, and we could actually start recording and then click this button here, Analyze this visual on the visual itself. And we're going to be able to actually see how long it takes for the different elements of this visual to be able to evaluate, to render. And we see that the DAX query, it takes less than a second, but it's still much longer than if we refresh everything. It's taking quite a bit longer than the other things on the page. So we might want to copy that query or even run that query in the DAX query view. So if we click that button, we get the query immediately in this DAX query view of Tabular Editor, of Power BI Desktop. And then once we have this DAX query view available, we could actually start to inspect, what is actually happening here. What are all the filters that are happening, and so on and so forth. But if we really want to dig into the performance details, we're not going to be able to do that in the DAX query view here, which is beneficial for when we want to query our model, when we want to use, create measures, if we want to leverage Copilot. All of that stuff can be useful for when we're using that DAX query view. But if we really want to dive into the performance, then we need to use a tool called DAX Studio. So DAX Studio is a tool so we can paste the DAX query that's available here, and we can connect to this model that's open in Power BI Desktop. And then we run that query. And we're not just going to get the query results like we did in the DAX query view, but we can also check for the query plan and the server timings. So if we click these two buttons, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to get a detailed amount of performance statistics about the query that we've copied here. So I'm not going to make any changes to this query, even though typically, you would clean up the query to make it easier to read and understand. But if we run that query again, we're going to have an overview of all of the formula engine and storage engine timings so that we can dive into specific parts of the query that are bottlenecks that we might want to investigate farther. And of course, this is more technical. This does require a bit of a deeper understanding of DAX, but you definitely can use this information to inform decisions about what you're going to change in either what you're using in that visual, like the formatting if you're using multiple measures, or the DAX itself, or even in your model potentially. And the query plan is just going to show you the steps of how that query is actually evaluating. And again, like I said, this is something that's quite technical and it takes some effort to be able to go through this, but it's something that can be very beneficial when you do run into these performance bottlenecks to be able to at least know where you should look in order to start to solve the problem. So that is, in a nutshell, DAX Studio. At SQLBI, we have a lot of other videos and courses if you need help on being able to optimize and understand DAX. So feel free to check those out if you're looking for more information. But that is all we're going to talk about, at least for now. So what I also want to talk about is the Tyndall view. So we already talked briefly about the DAX query view, which you can use, as the name suggests, of course, to run and evaluate DAX queries. Now, with the DAX query view, you can also make changes to your model. So it's not just a read-only tool. It's also, if you have a local model open in Power BI Desktop, you can also have measures defined, for example. So we have all these different measures here, and we can actually then change the DAX of multiple measures at once, or use Copilot to help us do that. And then we can update those changes to the model. So here it says update model with changes. So if we make any changes to the DAX that we have here in our defined measure, if we push this button, it's going to push those changes into our model. Of course, it's important to keep in mind that we can't Control Z to get those changes, undone. We have to press Control Z inside the scope of this query and then update it again. So you have to sometimes be careful that you don't make any unintended changes, but this can definitely be beneficial, especially if you're intent on leveraging the features of Copilot to be able to streamline this process or get some assistance. Now, the Tyndall view is a bit different. The Tyndall view is using what are called Tyndall scripts, which you can view by even going in here, so in selecting model, and then dragging semantic model, you can script your entire model. And it's going to create a script, which is just essentially going to be your model in the Tyndall format. And Tyndall stands for the Tabular Model Definition Language. So that is what Tyndall stands for. And the Tyndall script is just a create or replace with the model metadata, a few other more subtle and nuanced differences that are going to show you all of the different properties, the expressions, this kind of thing, all at once. So this applies to our entire model when we're dragging our model in, but it could also apply to just a few measures, for example. So if we wanted to view all these measures at once, so that we select here, so I can just Control select them, drag them in, and then I get these 3 different measures. I can see their properties and their expression at once in Power BI Desktop. So why is this useful? Why is this interesting? Well, one of the main reasons is being able to have visibility on properties that you couldn't see before. So for instance, this table brands, if I press enter here, so this is a property that normally I can't see in Power BI Desktop, but if I press Control spacebar, I can get a list of all of the properties that are available for this table, for instance. So if I go is private, and then I go true, that is actually a property that I can't normally access from Power BI Desktop. And if I preview, so I now can preview these changes. So I can now see that I have added this is private here to the model metadata. I can apply that change. And once I apply that change, now this brand table isn't visible anymore because I've set it to private. Setting something to private will hide it from client tools. So if I set it to false and I apply that change again, now the brands table is visible again. So this is an example of a functional property that you normally can't access in Power BI Desktop, but you can view and access from this Tyndall view. So that might be reason number one why you would use it. Reason number two could be if you want to make bulk changes. For example, if I want to change turnover to gross sales, for example, I could potentially do that here. And there's 433 instances. You just have to be careful that you're not going to be making any unintentional changes, which is especially why things like this preview button are going to be useful, as well as the highlighting that we have here that's going to show us where those changes are actually going to occur. For instance, here, both in a reference with the expression and the actual title of the measure itself. If we wanted to apply those changes, replace all, then it's going to make that replacement throughout my entire model. So I no longer have to then manually go through and rename everything one by one, or use an external tool like Tabular Editor in order to do that. Of course, you just have to make sure that you preview those changes first. And if you get any errors, then you have to be able to check why you're getting those errors, such as here, which can always happen when you're making those bulk changes. It's just important to be aware that this Tyndall script, so when you're making changes via the Tyndall script, that it's a all or nothing thing. So if I'm going to, for example, add in a script here for this brand column, so brand, and then I'm working in the user interface, and I rename this column to, for example, Mark or whatever. I'm thinking in Dutch, like Merk. And I go back. So the script is not going to update with whatever you're doing in the user interface. So you might not necessarily want to keep those scripts. And you also want to be careful because it's also not going to prompt you to keep the script if you delete it. So if, for example, like I was to set the table to private and then delete the script, it would be kind of hard for me to make that table unprivate again, for instance. So like everything, there's, this give and take to keep in mind. So that is a very brief overview of the Tyndall scripts. So we talked already about a number of different tools that you can leverage, focusing mainly on semantic models. And the main reason why that is because for reports, there's just simply not a lot of tools that are out there yet. There are slowly starting to be more and more tools like Power Designer, which is a tool that's going to help you create themes and also wireframes for your reports. But other than that, there's not a whole lot that's there. So this is starting to change now with the new Power BI Enhanced Report format, which is a new metadata format for reports. And this is something that is enabling a lot of new options. So if we look at, for example, Fabric notebooks, there's a lot of exciting possibilities that we can look into. So I'm just going to navigate to Power BI, and we're going to look at some of those examples. So a lot of these examples come from a training that's coming out from Tabular Editor about notebooks that I produced. And it's about notebooks for Power BI. So if you've never used or heard of a notebook before and you want an introduction from A to Z, everything you need to know about the basics of notebooks and how to use them with models and reports, then that training will have you covered. It's completely free and you can access it from learn.tabulareditor.com. So if you're going to be using a notebook, you have to create it in a workspace of Fabric. And a notebook basically looks like this. You have these different cells, like cells that contain text or markdown, and cells that contain code, like in Python. But you can, of course, also have other languages. Just in this particular case, we're using Python. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to leverage two libraries known as Semantic Link and Semantic Link Labs. We're going to make sure that we have the latest version installed of those libraries. And these libraries are specific to Fabric, and they allow us to be able to leverage a lot of functions that can give us easy access to both semantic models and reports. There's a lot more that we can do with these, with, for example, managing and connecting to and using other items in Fabric, like lakehouses, data warehouses, and so forth. But the focus right now is just on Power BI. So I'm just going to leave it there. And there's a lot of very exciting things that we can do. For example, we can actually make programmatic changes to reports in our notebook, from a notebook. Why would you want to do this? Well, think about it. When you are having to make formatting changes to multiple visuals in a report, or even multiple visuals across reports, this can take a tremendous amount of time. And honestly, this is the kind of thing that drives me completely insane. So you can save a ton of time by just doing it from a notebook. You can just make those changes in a single code cell, and then you don't have to worry about it moving forward. So let's look at some examples of those. I'm just going to make sure that we have the libraries, and I'm going to get that latest report. So a lot of these functions only work if you're having your report in the latest format of Power BI Enhanced Report format, which is in preview. But if you want more information about that, I suggest you check the Microsoft documentation or the preview features in Power BI Desktop. So we're not going to look at all the different changes that you can make, but we're going to jump straight to some of the exciting stuff, just so I can kind of give you a bit of an idea of what's possible. We can do things like changing the visual types, for example. So I have a function here that's going to change visuals from one type to another, just from our notebook. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down a little bit farther, and I'm going to actually write some code here to launch our report. And we can open reports inside of notebooks to be able to use them interactively. So we're just going to see what we're starting with here. And it looks like we've got a pretty messy report. It's got a lot of issues. It's got some kind of an overview page, a second page that's clearly not done, and a tooltip page that needs to be hidden. We also see that we have this donut chart here. A lot of people have some very strong feelings about donut charts, as we've written about in the past. So let's say, hypothetically, this isn't going to make our reports any better, and it's not a solution to any problem, but just to demonstrate the possibilities, let's say we want to change our pie or donut charts to a different chart type. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's first start by clearing this output. And then we're going to actually use this new function that we made using Semantic Link and Semantic Link Labs. And we're actually going to, on page 2, change the donut chart to a bar chart. So let's go ahead and do that. Hopefully it works, because this is something I just did not too long ago. But again, these are also just some very straightforward examples of the kinds of things that you can do. For example, changing visual types from a notebook, for instance. So that's actually what it's doing now. It's going into the visual metadata, and it's making a change from donut chart to bar chart. And then we can view the results, and we can actually see that it's changed. So we've updated that visual. Let's see if we can observe that now in the report. We're going to launch it again. And indeed, we see that now we've changed it from a donut chart to a bar chart. So let's say, for example, that you want to make changes, formatting changes to multiple visuals at once, not just, changing the visual type, but also changing the colors, changing what fields are involved. And normally, this is the kind of thing that can take days, even weeks, if you have a lot of reports. Now, from a notebook, you can just iterate and do this all programmatically. So let's look at some more examples of this. Let's look at swapping data fields, for example. So we have a function that I wrote that does that, and we're going to change some of these fields. Instead of using actuals, one of the measures in the model, it's going to use the number of customers. And we're only going to do this on that first page. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to swap out the fields. So this is something that's very common, changing the fields that we want to use. In this case, it didn't find any, but that's because I have this set up wrong. So from and to, and we'll run it again. I had it going backwards, and it didn't find those fields, which is why I gave that result. So we'll run it again. So to check what it looks like already now. So we have all showing the actuals here, actuals, 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 and multiple visuals. And if we wanted to change this to show the number of customers instead, normally doing this manually, we'd have to set up the formatting. It's just a huge pain in the butt. So now we've replaced 14 instances of these fields. So we can validate whether that's the case, launching the report again in the notebook, looking at the overview, and we can see now that we're looking at the number of customers instead of the actuals, right? So great. So I'll clear that output, but let's say I don't want to do that. I can go ahead and I can change it back, which is actually what I had in the first place, because of course I was testing this. Now we're going to change it back from customers to actuals. And once that's done, then again, we can just validate it. So you can appreciate that this is normally a manual task that you would have to do inside of Power BI Desktop or in the Power BI service. And even though it's something so simple, like changing what measure you're using in 4 different visuals, just the simple fact that you would have to reset up that formatting means that this would take you potentially like 20 to 30 minutes or longer. Now, it's just taking us a few seconds. So you can appreciate how much of a time saver this is. So cool, but what about other things? Let's change the colors, for example. So we saw that we had those ugly black colors. Let's change it to something even uglier. And let's make it some kind of like salmon pink or whatever. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to change the colors. And you'll see here that we only have 3 instances of the color. And then we're going to view the report. Go to the overview, and we see we have this lovely hot pink here. Now you might be wondering, why is the hot pink occurring only here and not here? Well, the reason is because this visual here and here are using theme colors, whereas these ones are using custom colors. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. When you're using a notebook to change reports, or even to change the model, you need to be aware of what the actual metadata is saying. So for example, custom colors are only going to be in there if in the user interface you actually set a custom color. If it's using a theme color, then it's not going to reference the color hex code. It's going to reference it differently. So setting up these kind of like custom solutions and leveraging Semantic Link and Semantic Link Labs this way, it can still require a bit of legwork on your part, particularly to understand how this metadata works. But again, this is just an example to show you what's possible to kind of start ideating. Okay, so we can change colors. I'm not going to change it back because screw it, I like pink. So now let's do something even cooler. Let's do some visual templates. So this is actually where I've been using Semantic Link and Semantic Link Labs the most, reusing visuals. As you know from our previous articles, atomic design is something that's very important to me and I think is very useful. So the more we can reuse stuff, the better. So we have a function here that I'm now going to use to reuse a particular visual by stating the ID. This is a very simple example where we're just basically copying a visual from one page to another, but then we're replacing the field as we go. So it's building upon what we already did. And we just want to be able to go back and say, on that incomplete page that we were working on, we want to add those same visuals from some other pages. This is a trivial example, but you can imagine that you create a really cool visual that you want to reuse in other reports. And that visual is very complicated. There's a lot of formatting and MacGyvering happening. Well, now you can save the definition for that visual somewhere in kind of like a glossary report. And it's a template that you can just reuse using a notebook. And this is something that I'm starting to do more regularly, and it saves a tremendous amount of time. So we see here that we've actually applied now and copied that visual over. So if we launch the report, we can see the result where we've had that visual added to the second page. And it's just a simple visual. So previously this top left corner was completely blank. Now we have that card. It has number of customers, which is the measure that we told it to use. And it's using the formatting that we've set up. So we don't have to set up that formatting again. So think about how much time you've spent trying to get tables right, trying to get matrices right, trying to, make sure the width of everything is fine and the conditional formatting is there. You don't have to do that again. Now, if you have the interest and the capability, you could leverage notebooks to turn that visual into a template and then just copy it over. So these are just a few very straightforward examples. Again, we have a course coming out from Tabular Editor, which is completely free, and it's going to teach you all about notebooks for Power BI people, including Semantic Link and Semantic Link Labs, and these kind of extensions, or let's say expansion pack functions that you can create yourself to do these kind of things. If you found this interesting, that's great. I hope you found this useful. As always, I hope you enjoy making reports and leverage tools in order to do so. Have a toolbox mentality. Don't just focus on the 1 or 2 tools that you use today. Look outside of your fence to see what other tools you could leverage that could help save you time, save you effort, and just give you less of a headache, particularly when it comes to these kind of monotonous tasks like formatting visuals and stuff. So that's all for now. I'll see you in the next one.